Good morning, everyone. Please just give us a couple minutes as we allow people to enter the room and we get set up, but we'll be starting in just a couple of minutes. I will give people till 12:03 my time. So just give us 2 minutes, please, and we'll get started. Right. Good morning, everyone. A pleasure to see so many of you joining the call. It's my real pleasure to be chairing this afternoon's call. My name is Julian Barnes-Dacey. I am the programs director for Africa and the Middle East and North Africa, the European Council on Foreign Relations. And we have a really interesting, distinguished crowd for a conversation on the Sahel, and particularly on the European role in the Sahel that we're going to hold over the next hour. We have a wonderful group of speakers. We have a very interesting group very interesting audience from across the EU and Africa, and I think this should be a very interesting, relevant, and timely conversation. This will be an on-the-record conversation, just to get the logistics out of the way, so please bear that in mind. And we are welcoming three very distinguished panelists. Emanuela Del Rey is the EU Special Representative for the Sahel. Minister Timon Coulibaly is the former Minister of Defense and Foreign Affairs in Mali. And also very delighted to have Will Brown, who's a Senior Policy Fellow with ECFR's Africa program, and who has just published a new paper for ECFR, Aligned in the Sand, How Europeans Can Help Stabilize the Sahel, which is available on our website, which we should share in the chat function at one point over the course of this call, and which assesses current dynamics in the Sahel and thinks a bit about where the EU and broader European states can go next in terms of addressing that situation. I am going to invite initial comments from the three speakers. We're going to have a bit of a Q&A question session. But at one point, I am going to be very much welcoming questions from the floor. So if you do want to come in, if I could kindly ask you to pose your question in the Q&A function down below, and then I will make sure that I pose that question to the relevant speaker or to a group of them. So without further ado, let's get started. As I say, this is a very timely moment given everything that's happening in the Sahel. It's an area of the world where clearly the Europeans are struggling amidst a kind of a decade of failed or at least struggled interventions. And obviously we see the situation on the ground continuing to deteriorate according to various indicators. So really, we just want to get a sense of exactly how does this look from the ground and where there may be space for a recalibrated European response to think a bit more strategically about how and where Europeans can act here. So I want to start with initial comments from Will Brown, my colleague at ECFR. As I say, Will Brown has just published this paper with ECFR. Will has spent a lot of the time on the ground in the Sahel, assessing these dynamics, working and speaking to people who are there, as well as to European officials and African officials working on the file. So Will, perhaps I could come to you first, if you could help us set the scene a bit in terms of your understanding of how dynamics are on the ground and your core message to Europeans in terms of where they should be going next as they try and address some of the very acute issues that they're facing.
Well, thank you very much, Julian, and our esteemed guests. So, okay, so ladies and gentlemen, the situation on the ground. I mean, the Europeans among us cannot hide from it. Just a few short years ago, the Sahel was described as a laboratory for a coordinated foreign and defense response policy. And I mean, there's no hiding from it. A decade of military, humanitarian, and developmental interventions in the Sahelian states of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger have failed comprehensively. In fact, if you're being harsh and a little bit reductionistic, you could probably argue that Europe's failure to stand up adequately to Putin's rabid aggression in Ukraine could have been read years ago in the Sahelian stars. So, I mean, Burkina Faso is close to complete collapse. Mali is not faring much better. And the Nigerian government, once the West's key ally in the region, may or may not be in a state of paranoid delusion. And so many of the Gulf of Guinea states are staring down, if not fighting, well-armed, well-funded jihadist groups who are battle-hardened on their northern borders. The jihadists have infiltrated northern Ghana, and there seems to be a perilous, but so far, thank God, bloodless game of cat and mouse between the Ghanaian security forces and jihadists affiliated to Al-Qaeda. This could soon change, and many officials in Accra are worried that they could soon be dragged into the war. And to make matters worse, there are real fears that military coups, inspired by the disinformation and events kind of in the central Sahelian states, could soon spread to other countries. And so at the same time, we've had this kind of extraordinary situation where the central Sahelian states have turned into this extraordinary example of a new multipolar world. So, you know, everyone from China, Iran, Morocco, Nicaragua, Russia, Turkey, the UAE, Venezuela, and even potentially North Korea are all kind of stepping up to try and leverage the crisis to their advantage. Russia, of course, as everyone knows, has positioned itself as the main security guarantor in the central Sahelian juntas. And we are in this kind of strangely kind of paradoxical situation, I would argue, where Russia dominates the information sphere in the Sahel for its disinformation operations, but at the same time, it's painfully obvious to everyone that Moscow is utterly and woefully ill-equipped to fundamentally change anything on the ground. And so what have the Europeans done in the face of this kind of grand failure? Well, I would argue, and I do so in my policy brief, which I would be honored if you had a look at, is that we have kind of, the Europeans have scattered in all directions. So some have tried to firewall the juntas off. Others have thrown their hands up in disgust at the mass human rights abuses and have walked away. Some have tried to keep conversations going, treading that kind of delicate middle line with kind of aid flowing, humanitarian development money flowing, and others have kind of seen more kind of strategic kind of cooperation with the juntas as essential to their kind of fundamental interests on migration or security. And so I think, kind of just to summarize, I think the central argument we try to put across in our policy brief is that Europeans need to stay engaged. I would argue that the hardline approach kind of some European member states have taken has not worked. It has not served Europe's best interests. In fact, it's ended up intensifying feelings of suspicion, rejection, and resentment among local armed forces and populations. And I think also it's kind of left the ground open for all manner of kind of hostile powers who are hostile to Europe's interests and frankly don't give a damn how they leave what state they leave the Sahel in. So we argue that Europe should not close its embassies. European countries should not close their embassies. They should not slash developmental aid. They should not slash humanitarian spending. Instead, Europeans should focus on stabilizing the diplomatic crisis and maintaining kind of in-country expertise, information gathering networks, and kind of fundamentally to try and counterbalance some of these hostile powers in the region and quietly but incrementally support kind of democratic and civic advances. And at the same time, of course, Europe is doing a lot of good work in the Gulf of Guinea. We argue that they should redouble those efforts. And speaking frankly, just as a closing point, I really do feel that kind of at this state we are in the world right now, wagging a kind of white Europe deals with hostile powers and walking away. Well, I think this achieves very little other than irrelevance and the entrenched I'm very eager to hear from my fellow panelists.
Well, thank you very much for those opening comments, and thank you for laying out the policy paper, which is a really rich read, and I hope that colleagues on the call will find the time to read. Minister Coulibaly, let me come to you next. You just heard a view from Europe in terms of how the situation is perceived here. There's obviously a lot of self-reflection about the perceived failures of the European approach towards the Sahel over the last decade. And there's also a real sense of risk about what is happening on the ground and where this could go next. So it would be wonderful to get your perspective on how you assess current developments on the ground, and what would be your message to Europeans as they're looking back on these failures and thinking forward to where they go next in terms of engagement.
Well, thank you, and thank you for inviting me. Good morning, everyone. Over the past few years, your countries have been engaged in helping to counter terrorism and stabilize many friends' countries of Central Sahel, including mine, the Republic of Mali. I remember I participated in a seminar. It was in November 2011, organized by the External Action Service of EU. And at that time, Lopez Blanco was the head of West and Central Africa. It was organized with the observatory of the late Soumeilou Boubèye Maïga, who was prime minister and died in prison 2 years ago. The aim of this seminar was to contribute to the formulation of a Sahel strategy for the European Union. And I think the strategy was adopted in 2012, and it was a consistent one. But despite all the efforts of each other, European Union and Sahelian countries, there is today a feeling of unfinished and even failure, as you said. I think because in action, there has been little coherence between Europeans. It was often thought that the Sahel was a French problem because many of the states in this space, in this area, are former French colonies. And I would like to be proved wrong in saying that at times, Europeans not only lacked coherence, but sometimes has been in opposition and even rivalry in the conduct of their actions in the Sahel and in West Africa. Yes, I must admit that the poor governance of African partners did not help to build success. The point is, today, the situation is continually deteriorating. In addition to the present horrors, we can see that would be worse to come if the Sahel should continue to drift into violence. In Mali, in July 24th, a fierce battle opposed Wagner and Fama to the Malian armed rebels of CSP-DPR. It resulted in a severe defeat of Wagner and Fama, Malian armed forces. On September 17th, at dawn, Bamako was hit by a dozen of terrorists from Jamaat Nusra. Two critical premises were attacked at the same time: the School of Gendarmerie and the International Airport of Bamako, including the main Air Force base in Bamako. And that day, the death toll was unprecedented. Those two events, I tend to assert, marked a turning point and confirmed, of course, the worsening and uncertain and volatile situation in Mali. Meanwhile, Wagner was eager to collect the dead bodies of its militants killed on July 24th in Tinzawaten. This operation, called Vengeance, is today struggling to move forward. And a lot of sources report that things are getting complicated between Malian army and Wagner. And a Malian drone was missing in action a few days ago. And I heard that it was found in Djebok, east of Gao, where an area which is under control of Islamic State in the Greater Sahara. In Niger, you've all heard an official announcement to disjoin some personality from their nationality. And the immediate response was an attack on 3 positions of Niger forces near Tilaberi. And this attack was claimed by Rissa Agbula on behalf of Forces Armées Libres, 3 armed forces, which is now a new actor fighting against the junta in Niger. In Burkina Faso, on September 23rd, the government announced that it had foiled the plot, and the aftermath was the launch of international arrest warrants for some personalities, including politicians in exile, whose families are persecuted. And this is the case of Djibril Bassolé, the former Minister of Foreign Affairs, whose children are arrested at the moment. In these 3 countries, violence has but developed since the return of coups. We witness abuses of all kinds on a daily basis. Terrorist forces have dramatically expanded the areas they control. The humanitarian situation is totally degraded, and millions of displaced people are trying to find shelter wherever possible. This is likely to pose a complex challenge to the whole region. Obviously, we all know that today the threat is now on neighboring countries, as Mr. Brown said. All countries of the Gulf of Guinea are concerned by the risk of mounting widespread violence and the expansion and terrorism, but above all, political destabilization. Let us note that the resurgence of coups in West Africa coincides with the rise of the interest of Russia for this region. And those coups d'etat are a kind of culmination of a sharp disinformation campaign which started quite a long ago. Those operations are organized and financed by some powers that want to take a lasting control over the Sahelian area, and that of ECOWAS and even further. And of course, our region tends to become the field of confrontation between powers. And bearing in mind the current crisis of multilateralism, I think the stakes are high for all of us. Nonetheless, I think there must be no room for ambiguity. It is clear that there is today at least a double standard in dealing with those new authoritarian regimes. But let us be positive about this. There is no such thing as peace and security without justice and liberty. And you all very well know that already. And I think there will be little hope to succeed in bargaining with the military juntas and the current authoritarian ruling systems in the Sahel. One must ask a simple question: does democracy matter? The answer to me is yes. And I must say to you, my friends, that the fate of our ambitions, European and Africa and our ambition for the Sahel and in the Sahel depends on the response we will all together give to that question. ECOWAS must not be scattered, because the consequence will be isolated countries and immediately vulnerable to more destabilization. I think EU should remain engaged for the sake of global security and mutual prosperity, of course. Let us bear and keep in mind that we should help ECOWAS to resist. Otherwise, we will pave the way for more destruction, more despair, more horrors. I don't mean to be long, but what is happening in Mali, in Niger, and in Burkina Faso is totally unacceptable. On a daily basis, some communities are targeted, and each and every day we have reported massacres all over our territories. So, my friends, I think this is a time to remain mobilized and engaged. Of course, learning lessons from what we've done together in the past few years. Thank you.
Minister Coulibaly, many thanks. And I'm going to come back to you in the second round to prod you a bit on what those lessons should be, so we can move forward in a more effective manner. But let me turn now to Emanuela Del Rey, the EU Special Representative for the Sahel. Emanuela, you've been doing this job now for 3 years, and it's obviously comes to a moment where there's a lot of European questioning, doubts about our effectiveness. The minister was talking about our lack of coherence, and meanwhile, both Will and the minister were talking about the dire situation on the ground. Should Europeans stay engaged? Can they stay engaged? What is your argument as you go around EU capitals, as you're in Brussels? How are you making the case for a more effective European response, and on what basis, if I might ask?
Thank you very much. Well, I will react immediately by saying that when we talk about the Sahel, we talk about 2 different fronts. One front is the European Union, internal dynamics of the European Union, and the other front is the Sahel itself. I've been working on both, being on the ground continuously. I will be in Abidjan and Bamako, in Nouakchott, in Chad, in N'Djamena, and other places in the next 2 months, just to give you an example. But the real problem is how to harmonize all these elements to create a proper effectiveness of our existing strategy that was defined in 2021. Well, I can tell you that when we talk about failure, I'm against this kind of drastic judgments, because this does not take into account the huge effect of our development cooperation, of our continuous dialogue, because we don't realize how much interlocution there is between us, European Union, and the countries of the Sahel. And also the humanitarian aid. We are the main provider of humanitarian aid at a global level as European Union. I'm proud to say this. And at the same time, we are also amongst the main providers of humanitarian aid in the Sahel. If we call this a failure today, I don't think it's a failure, because without us, it would have been very difficult for the communities to survive. And a lot of advancements that have been achieved in the quality of life of the communities in the Sahel is certainly due to our policy. Of course, we can criticize the fact that under the security point of view, everything changed in 2021 when Mali decided to call the Wagner group and we suspended all our missions. But under the point of view of our relation with the countries of the Sahel, probably analysts and researchers don't pay too much attention to the fact that we are still the main partner of each country of the Sahel. In Mali, for instance, despite all the crises and all the problems and, of course, the difficult dialogue, we have still 1 billion euro in terms of development cooperation ongoing, and so in the other countries. So when we talk about a failure, what does it mean, failure? It's easy to start from a thesis and demonstrate the thesis rather than starting from an hypothesis and demonstrate the hypothesis. So I'm against this kind of drastic judgments, because don't give a correct picture of the situation. Regarding other things that have been said, I will go fast because we don't have enough time. Well, I can tell you that, of course, regarding the internal front, for me, it has not been easy. I am about to end my mandate, and I will do the same things in another position. But as far as I have done, I think that I have been fighting very much to obtain that the European Union member states would declare their absolute commitment to stay engaged in the Sahel. So we cannot say the European Union should stay engaged, because we are going to stay engaged. And this was declared in the Foreign Affairs Council on the 19th of February this year, 2024. And the will is there, the understanding of the situation is there. The problem is how. And here we come to the front of the Sahel itself. How to deal with countries that are not respecting the constitutional order, countries with which we have a dialogue, except for Niger, but I will say a word about that. Countries with which we continue to cooperate, as I said, in a difficult climate, political climate, aware of the fact that there are huge security problems, with the difficulty of activating our security support, because in terms of development, we are changing our system, but we are still there. In terms of humanitarian, we don't change anything because we stay by the side of the population. But regarding security, we cannot activate, for instance, the instruments that we have at our disposal, that we are activating only at the moment in Mauritania, but in a limited way, and something in the Gulf of Guinea, but again, in a limited way. Because the situation is very difficult, and we don't want to intervene in that kind of domain. So as you can see, the internal front of the European Union is striving to fight a balance. The real problem, and here I come to the need to do analysis on these aspects, is something that I want to say bluntly, because I have found a lot of difficulties in this sense, is the fact that it has been said by our analyst when he was talking about scattered reactions by the European Union. Well, is the fact that because of the lack of leadership at the European Union level, in the sense that the leadership was always trying to rely more on ECOWAS rather than taking its own actions, we have seen a transformation of the European Union as, so to speak, a reference actor, but not an active actor, not a proactive actor. We have a lot of bilateral relations which are much more consistent in terms of relation of member states of the European Union to the countries of the Sahel, rather than the famous Team Europe spirit of the European Union applied in this particular region. This is something I have been trying to change, but it has been very difficult for a number of reasons. And now we find that, for instance, Germany is a giant in the region, doesn't care about the opinions of the European Union as a body, not as a group of member states, of course. And of course decides on the use of its own investments. The same with Italy, that keeps its own small contingent in Niger, and others that are doing the same, taking their own decisions. Some, unfortunately, are closing down embassies, but in general, the presence of the European Union at bilateral level is very, very, very consistent. And lately also newcomers such as Hungary, but also, I don't know, intensifying the attention from northern countries. It's very important in the Sahel. So as you can see, the situation is quite complex, and complexity, I think, is something we have to take into account when talking about the Sahel. Nothing is easy in the Sahel. One thing I want to say about our company, in the sense that the European Union is not alone, because we have bilateral relations of the member states, the European Union that accompanies the ECOWAS, but I would say more that it delegates to ECOWAS. And I've been saying to the 27 member states of the European Union lately, especially in the Political and Security Committee, that we cannot rely completely on ECOWAS, because ECOWAS is fragile itself. And the different personalities of the countries within ECOWAS, which I know very well, from heads of state to civil society, are very different, diversified. And so the best thing for the European Union would be to start to be proactive, to express its own position strongly, not only regarding the return to a constitutional order, but also with concrete actions accompanying ECOWAS, because ECOWAS, of course, it's our regional counterpart, which we support strongly and completely, but accompanying is much better than just delegating. And this also in harmony with the fact that we have international actors such as, for instance, the UN, the World Bank, the US, who are going in a completely different direction. Regarding Niger, for instance, I was in Washington 10 days ago, speaking to everybody, of course, from the Department of State to the Pentagon, considering that there will be elections very soon in the United States. Well, their perception about the countries of the Sahel is different from ours. For instance, they talk about a certain flexibility in Niger, compared to the idea that Niger is completely closed, not willing to cooperate. And when I spoke to some important Nigerians, the ambassador of Niger, he said that he would like to have an opportunity to intensify the relationship with the European Union, because, of course, these countries have a huge experience, and we have to understand how important they are in our dynamics and how clever they are in their decisions. And, of course, they realize that without the European Union, it would be very difficult to have an advancement in their societies. So, as you can see, we are going in a different direction. The UN visited Niger at the level of Amina Mohammed, a good friend of mine, a fantastic woman, very strong, that actually went to Niger, to Mali and Burkina Faso to bring her own experience. So we are in a very strange situation. To conclude, I want to say that, yes, of course, we have Russia, Iran, China. Russia and China were there since decades. Iran is a newcomer, and of course we have to keep under control, but we have to understand that in order to be continue to have our special relationship with the countries of the Sahel, we have to intensify our relationship, not the contrary. Last word I want to say, we are in competition not with China and Russia, but with the great powers who want to become the leaders of the global South. And of course, we have a great alliance with India, but in terms of their policy on the ground, of course, we will have to define our own profile, because India, that has already made a huge step ahead, including the African Union in the G20, of course, will have its own way of looking at things. And where does the European Union stand if it doesn't really become a proactive actor, as I hope it will become? This is a serious problem. It's an ethical dilemma regarding security. I think that given that we are in front of not only terrorists, but terrorists mixed with criminals, of course, we will have to find some way of supporting the countries, because they're really lacking military support, for instance. And we all know that Russia, by their own admission, is not providing a real support. They are providing an illusion of support, and they know it, because these countries, as I said, can teach us just a lot of things rather than just learn from us. So it's an ethical dilemma for the European Union, which adds to all the problems that I've just explained. Last point is Burkina Faso. Just to give you an example, I've been fighting for Burkina Faso. Sometimes I didn't sleep at night because I know that it's the most suffering country and the country that constitutes the epicenter of all the security problems, humanitarian problems, and also development problems. So I am still fighting for Burkina Faso, very difficult, but unless we understand how important it is to support countries that have a huge impact on our own problems and basing our interest about our approach on interest rather than just the principles, of course, unless we do this, we will remain more, let's say, inefficient. Thank you.
Emanuela Del Rey, many thanks for those initial comments. Will, let me come back to you. I don't know if there's anything you want to pick up from those comments, but obviously both the minister and the special representative talking a lot about the kind of centrality of the security dimension and the way that that is dominating what's happening on the ground, but also in a sense sidelining the European ability to do some of the things that they want to do or are doing. How do you wrestle with that dilemma? I mean, obviously the Europeans haven't had a great record in certain terms of security engagement over the last decade. What are the kind of arguments that you lay out in terms of how Europeans can stay involved, stay engaged, working with or around those security dynamics and the security track to try and ameliorate the situation? That's a question that comes up in a couple of the questions in the chat function. There's also a question there, which I'll pose to you now, about the informational aspect. You've written a lot about disinformation, and there's a question there that isn't everything Europe doing, doesn't it all get perceived through a kind of neo-colonial lens? How should Europe present itself as it's trying to work as a partner with African states to try and make some of these positive differences that you've talked about?
Wow. Okay. Well, first of all, let me just come back off and just say thank you very much for the comments of my panelists, fellow panelists who put so many points so eloquently. I don't have time, I guess, to respond to all of them, but just to come back on a few. Has the kind of European engagement with the Sahel over the last decade been a failure? Emmanuel was pushing quite strongly against my point there. I would say. Yes, of course, this is why we advocate for continuing kind of humanitarian developmental support. We absolutely do not believe that should be cut in any way. It has had a huge impact on the ground. Absolutely, the situation could be so much worse. But we can hardly call this what the European engagement a success. We have tens of thousands of people dead, Russian mercenaries going around massacring people, Turkish drones blowing people up. As Mr. Koulibaly said, massacres are happening every day, and in Europe we don't even now deem them worthy anymore to report on them. That's kind of how extraordinary the situation is. So just now turning to the disinformation question, I mean, we really I really have tried to kind of emphatically argue this point based on conversations with just kind of a seemingly endless stream of different kind of disgruntled European diplomats who are kind of deeply frustrated with how the situation is going on the ground. Any further European actions in the Sahel will amount to very little if Europe does not overhaul its toothless policies on anti-disinformation, which have basically left us kind of at the mercy of well-funded campaigns. And I think we need to Europe needs to move away from simply debunking disinformation and putting that out there and hoping that some people will pick up that this was fake news. And we need to be shifting much more onto kind of shifting the narrative onto the manifold failings and exploitative practices of other powers in the Sahel. I mean, Emanuela there I think put it brilliantly, the kind of illusion that Russia puts out there. And I think there's some interesting efforts going around Europe to counter disinformation by the various member states, obviously closer to home on the eastern front of Europe. The UK is doing some interesting work, Spain as well. But I think we all know that these programs are really inadequately staffed and funded to meet the scale of the challenges ahead. And I think what we argue for is that Europe needs a dedicated staff based in the region with expertise in local languages, kind of understanding local nuances on trends, not speaking to people in Brussels lingo, in French, former colonizers' language. We need to be supporting local bloggers, influencers, regional media outlets who are kind of critically interrogating what some of the claims or actions of powers like Russia, what they're doing in the region. And I think this requires a serious investment in resources and personnel. And we need to be working in non-official communication channels. We shouldn't just be working through an ambassador's Twitter account or ambassador's Facebook account. We need to be kind of coming much more into the reality of the 21st century. And I think we should be exposing, there's a wealth of intelligence out there. We should, among the European member states, showing exactly what some of these hostile powers are doing in the Sahel. And I think we should be exposing that, and whether that's murder or loot or corruption. Thank you.
Can I say something?
Please.
I just want to say that the European Union has a special team to fight against disinformation, Stratcom team. I only want to say that, of course, it's not easy to contrast disinformation, also because we cannot go against the law and develop trolls, for instance, which is exactly what Russia is doing, and China is also starting to do, and some others are starting to do. Nevertheless, after all my years of experience on the ground, I think that the real narrative that works is what we do on the ground, in the sense that many communities don't care about the disinformation and this narrative against France in particular, and the Western powers in a second, let's say, as a second choice of identifying the enemies. Also because it is true that people own a telephone, but they don't participate in the global debate. And most of the people don't have access to internet because it's very costly. Electricity is largely lacking. So we are talking about a phenomenon that is more for the elites, I would say, and parts of the activists and so on. So what really works, in my view, is to work on the ground to improve the security situation, to allow development cooperation personnel to work more and to be more effective. This is what works, because in the end, when I talk to our friends in the Sahel, we always talk about the fact that nobody wants to go to live in Russia. Everybody wants to migrate to France or to Europe, because we still have an image that is the image of a good welfare state and a good opportunity for life. So we have to work more on this sense, although, of course, it's fundamental to work against the disinformation, because disinformation must be dismantled as a tool of warfare as Russia is using it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Minister Coulibaly, let me come to you now. You painted a very kind of dire picture of what's happening on the ground, and you kind of left us on the cliff at the end when you said, okay, well, we need to take lessons from that and adjust and approach in a more effective way. So could you tell us what those lessons are in your viewpoint? I mean, what does a more effective stabilizing approach look like now? And as given that we're a European think tank thinking about a European engagement, is Europe really part of your thinking as you think about the lessons learned and how you plot a better way forward? And what would be your message to Europeans in terms of how to reconcile the security priorities that Emanuela just talked about, that others on the ground are talking about, and your own reference to the centrality of democracy? How does Europe balance those to make a positive difference, drawing on the lessons that I hope you will now tell us in terms of what a more effective strategy would look like in your eyes?
Well, thank you. Well, Madame Ray was right saying that there are two fronts. And regarding democracy, the second front is important. The Sahelian populations and the Sahelian civil society and political leaders must stand and continue to fight for democracy. But you see, it takes someone to help you to achieve a success. This is natural. And of course, the EU or the free world can have valuable contribution to helping to fight for democracy. Madame Del Rey was right also when she said that it's not a complete failure. The humanitarian actions are important because at the end of the day, it all is about humanity. It all is about humankind. What we all seek is to have a better life for the people in the Sahel. And what is happening today is destruction of those people. And we've talked about terrorism, we've talked about mercenaries. We must talk about the return of drug trafficking in this area. It's very important. She was right. Humanitarian actions are very important. And of course, the decision of the Malian junta to invite Russian mercenaries, to invite Wagner in our country was a bad deal. It was a catastrophe because one doesn't call the hyena to discipline a troublesome goat. And we're facing the terrible consequences of this decision. ECOWAS is fragile, that's the truth, but it's necessary. And I agree, it must be the European Union that can lend a hand to ECOWAS to resist, because the strategy of those powers or middle powers is to have a scattered ECOWAS. And if that should happen, then we cannot imagine succeeding in fighting against terrorism and drug traffickers. So it is necessary to accompany ECOWAS. The question of delegate or not delegate, yeah, can be discussed and find the best way to proceed. Mr. Brown has talked about Ghana. We should add Benin and Togo, Nigeria, of course, and an important country in West Africa, which is Côte d'Ivoire, also is under threat. So the engagement of EU should be reinforced in those countries. So we can have a kind of shield while maybe internal political forces in central states, in states of central Sahel, Mali, Burkina, and Niger can find a way to change the situation. Countering disinformation is very important, very important. Countering false narratives is crucial. Maybe only the elite has access to the internet, but the elite talks to the people. And the journalists give an echo to what, to those false narratives in radio stations all over the country. And the people listen to the radio. So I think disinformation and media manipulation are today a modern warfare, which is at the center of the strategy of those powers seeking to seize a lasting control of the Sahel. So let's be clear about it. It is necessary to give the true narrative. But it is also crucial to reveal the real face of those actors so the people can understand what is really going on. I repeat, the decision to invite Wagner, for example, was the baddest deal in the history of Mali. And we're paying the price, and we're paying the high price. And I repeat, the world should know that on a daily basis, we suffer massacres and some communities are targeted. So this is very important. And this information has helped to facilitate the introduction of Wagner in our country. But today, there is little changes. That's why we should keep being optimistic about a change to come. And that's why we should remain engaged. Security and defense questions are important to deal with the countries of the Gulf of Guinea, to help those armies to be well equipped and even help them to have enough technology and skilled people to master those new weaponry of modern war, because of course we are at war. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Special Representative Del Rey, let me come back to you. There's a question in the Q&A about the kind of EU security tools that hasn't activated that you referred to. Wondering if you could explain a bit what you mean by that, and given kind of the importance that you've stressed about the security situation, the same as Minister Coulibaly, what is your sense of whether and how the Europeans can engage in that issue? I mean, you've obviously talked about the humanitarian aid, the developmental aid, the wide range of engagement. Do you think the Europeans need to maintain a strong view and engagement on the security front if they're going to be relevant here? Or do you think we're frankly limited there? We should do what we can do on the margins, and as the space emerges and opens up, that will allow us to have more influence. And linked to that, this dilemma between kind of the security priorities on the ground, questions of democracies and values. How do you kind of bring those together in your own thinking and planning?
Well, when I was talking about the ethical dilemma, this is exactly what I am talking about. The fact that we are aware of the security problems, but we don't want to intervene with the military support. Although there is an appeal to us to intervene militarily with the support, of course, not with boots on the ground, but militarily by everybody. Every time I speak to presidents of, I don't know, the president of Mauritania, as well as the president of Ghana, or with activists, intellectuals, researchers, everybody asks me to make a campaign to obtain some military support for Burkina Faso in particular, but in general for the region. The problem is that Minister Coulibaly was referring to the idea that calling Wagner for Mali was the worst political move they could ever make. I remember I was the one who went to President Goïta, who is the president of Mali, who became president after the second coup d'etat, recent second coup d'etat in Mali, and I told him, Monsieur le Président, this is a decision that constitutes a real red line for the European Union. If you do so, there will be consequences. And the consequences were, number one, Barkhane, of course, end of Barkhane, also because there were the elections in France. So a number of dynamics. Every time you touch something in the world, as we see today, of course, there is a consequence. And this is a serious problem. And also, of course, we suspended our training mission in Mali European Union Training Mission, EUTM, which was our, let's say, jewel, because we trained more than 18,000 soldiers through the EUTM, and 18,000 soldiers is more than half of the current army of the Malians. So you can imagine what a disaster this became, because we were obliged by our principles to suspend every mission and every activity. And the EUTM ended, Barkhane left, Taguba never really started its activity. So in the end, we are not present. We have an instrument called EPF, European Peace Facility. We have activated it somewhere in Africa, but not in Somalia, for instance, yes, certainly, but not in the Sahel for the restrictions that we have due to the political situation. There is no doubt about it. We have done something, but not in a consistent way, because we are the 27 member states are trying to keep away from the military dimension of our presence, also because of Ukraine. As if we want to make the picture complete, Ukraine has had a huge impact on everything we have done. And of course, at the moment, the Sahel is not at the center of our military strategy for the world. So you can imagine how difficult it is. I want to say one thing, referring to the things that have been said so far. One of the reasons why we must remain engaged and we have to continue to pass the messages is the fact that, as I said, we are not alone in the world. We have like-minded countries who are acting in different ways. And also we have other entities in the world, such as the UN, who are going in a very, very strong direction regarding the Sahel, as we willing to support it, as well as the World Bank. I was with my friend Usman Diagana, who's the vice president of the World Bank, last week in Washington, and he was confirming that they are increasing the investments also in the Central Sahel. So when we talk about expanding to the Gulf of Guinea, yes, of course, but not forget the Central Sahel, also because a great part of the countries of the Gulf of Guinea want us to continue to support the Central Sahel, because the Central Sahel is the center of all the dynamics in the region. Think about Togo, for instance, as well as others. Togo is very much in favor of continuing and increasing our relationship with the countries, also at military level, but of course, as I said at the beginning, this would be very, very difficult. I know that some countries of the European Union at bilateral level want to intervene more with training, with equipment, in general in the military and security domain, more directly, in a bilateral relation. There was a moment in which some member states wanted to also support the countries with specific support. But for instance, I know that the Netherlands have been training special forces with the US, but this is well known. And also, of course, Germany is now thinking of supporting Mali. You know that the Minister of Defense went to Mali. So as you can see, the dynamics are very complex. The European Union, of course, is doing a lot, as I said, not in this field. We shall see in the future. Also because the great absent from our discussion so far is the African Union. Nobody mentioned the African Union. I want to mention it because I think that the African Union should be more present. Of course, they also delegated to ECOWAS, but we need African Union to be more present. Since the end of the actions of Maman Sidikou, who was a good friend of mine, but also a very efficient representative of the African Union of the Sahel, no one has been nominated yet. I have asked Moussa Faki, I have asked Bankole, but they are not yet ready to identify a new representative of the Sahel, which tells you a lot at political level. And which tells us as well that we need to recompose, let's say, the internal dynamics to our community surrounding the Sahel. So just to conclude my analysis, the very first point is that we want to remain engaged as a European Union. We continue with development cooperation and, of course, humanitarian forever. because that is the most important thing for us. Stay by the side of the populations. We should continue absolutely the dialogue, also because I always say, if we don't speak to these people, how can we pass the dialogue? We pass the message. I always pass the messages because I speak to them. Otherwise, this would be the end of our relationship, and anyone else can come in and take our place. So this is in general what I want to say.
Minister,
can I add a word?
I'm afraid we're going to have to end it here because people have expressed the need to end promptly, but I'm going to thank you all very much for some very interesting observations. This is clearly a beginning of a conversation from our end at ECFR that we haven't provided any concrete answers in the broader sense, but there's clearly a huge need to stay engaged, to think about how Europeans can be most effective, and obviously to grapple with the huge risks and challenges that are unfolding on the ground. So I want to thank everyone for participating in this conversation. I want to thank Will Brown for his contribution through his policy paper, Special Representative Del Rey, Minister Coulibaly. We've really appreciated your comments. I hope we can do this conversation again soon, and I wish you all a very good day. Thank you very much and goodbye.
Thank you.